When I finally found my own path, my brother tried to betray me for $3 million. My family watched it all fall apart, and then I never thought I'd set foot on that ranch again. But there I was, gripping the steering wheel as the endless Oklahoma plain stretched out before me. The invitation hadn't exactly come with open arms. It was a text from my mother, Janet, simple and guilt-laced. Grant, please come for my birthday. It's been 4 years. Let the past go. The moment I read it, I felt that tight knot in my stomach, the same one I'd felt 4 years earlier at what became the last family Thanksgiving I ever attended. That dinner haunts me even now, the laughter, the ridicule, the sting of my father Ronald's voice as he called me a disgrace in front of everyone we knew. My siblings Brian and Paige didn't even flinch at his words. If anything, they backed him up, piling on with their polished, superior tones. I deleted the message at first, but somehow, after a night of no sleep, I decided I'd go. Maybe it was the smallest hope of closure, or maybe I just wanted them to see the man they'd dismissed for so long. The drive from Houston to the outskirts of Oklahoma City felt longer than the 4 hours it took. Every mile closer to the ranch churned up old memories, me at 16, covered in dirt after building a shed from scraps, only to have my father scold me for wasting time. Me at 23, standing outside the family home after college graduation, listening to him praise Brian's law school acceptance and Paige's med school scholarship while pretending not to see me at all. I'd spent so long chasing their approval that the very thought of that house made my chest tighten. The ranch came into view just as the sun started to set, casting a golden haze over the dry fields and worn fences. The house looked smaller than I remembered, though the years hadn't changed its white siding or the wraparound porch where I'd spent so many lonely afternoons. As I pulled through the old gate, I felt more like a stranger arriving at a bed-and breakfast than a son returning home. My palms were sweating as I turned off the engine and stepped onto the gravel drive, each step toward the house heavier than the last. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and cedar, the same way it always had during the holidays. I spotted Brian first, lounging on the leather sofa I wasn't even allowed to touch as a kid unless given permission. He barely looked up, offering a polite, distant nod before turning his attention back to his phone. Paige stood near the fireplace, gesturing animatedly as she recounted what sounded like some complex heart surgery she'd performed. Their voices filled the room with that old familiar mix of arrogance and self-congratulation. My mother noticed me then, her face lighting up as she crossed the room and hugged me tightly. For a fleeting moment, I almost believed the warmth in her eyes. But before I could say anything, my father's voice cut through the room. He didn't greet me, didn't even look at me really, just muttered something to Brian about a neighbor's cattle deal and kept his back turned. Dinner was exactly what I had braced myself for, and yet still worse than I imagined. The conversation revolved entirely around Brian's recent courtroom victory, where he secured a $400,000 settlement for some corporate client. He went on and on about his brilliant legal maneuvering, basking in our parents' admiration as though he'd single-handedly saved the world. Paige took her turn next, describing in great detail a surgery she claimed no other doctor would have dared attempt. She spoke of it like she was some sort of hero, her words dripping with self-importance as our parents beamed with pride. No one asked about me. No one wondered what I'd been doing in those silent 4 years. I sat at the edge of the table, nodding and smiling on cue whenever someone glanced my way, the forgotten son playing the part of polite observer. I could feel myself shrinking with every toast to Brian's brilliance and every cheer for Paige's heroics. Then Brian, never able to resist twisting the knife, turned to me with that smirk I'd known since childhood. His voice carried just the right mix of mockery and concern as he asked, "So Grant, when are you finally going to do something worthwhile? Even Lily's ahead of you, and she's only 14. The table erupted in laughter, the kind that makes your skin crawl because you know it's at your expense. Paige chimed in without missing a beat, her tone sweet but cutting. Maybe if Grant waits another 50 years, that patch of land he bought will make him rich at 80. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached, but I said nothing. The laughter roared louder, a chorus of relatives and family friends leaning in with comments like, "Save me a spot on the moon when you get rich, Grant." My father's voice silenced the room with a sharp clink of his glass against the table. His eyes locked on mine, the disappointment in them so thick I could feel it in my bones. "You're an embarrassment," he said flatly, "a damn clown sitting at this table." I stood, heart pounding, fury burning through me. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I simply looked him dead in the eye and said, "You think I came here for this? I came because Mom asked me. But you know what? This is the last time. After tonight, I'm done trying. If I disgust you so much, go ahead, cut me off." The room froze, no one daring to speak. My father pointed toward the door, his face red with rage. "Get out of my house, you worthless fool." My hands trembled, but my voice stayed steady as I said, "Before I leave, there's something you should all know. I'm not the failure you believe me to be. My company, Grant Capital Developments, made $7.5 million in profit last year. And that ranch you're living on? I own it. Brian, I own the building where your firm leases space. Paige, that clinic you run? Mine too." I pulled out my phone, opened the property app, and showed them the deeds with my name, my digital signature, the proof they couldn't deny. The shock on their faces was worth more than any apology they could ever give. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving their stunned silence behind me. I didn't look back as I walked out that door, but inside my chest, my heart pounded like a drum, the rush of adrenaline making my hands shake as I climbed into the car. The cold night air felt sharp against my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without that familiar weight pressing down on me. The headlights cut through the dark country roads as I drove away from the ranch, the silence of the night only broken by the sound of gravel under my tires. My mind raced with everything that had just happened, the stunned expressions on their faces replaying over and over in my head like a movie I couldn't switch off. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't going to let their insults and laughter hang in the air without showing them the truth of who I had become. The next morning, I barely slept, but I got up before dawn and headed straight to the office. The skyline of Houston glowed pink in the rising sun, and as I stepped into my building, I felt a wave of determination stronger than anything I'd ever felt before. I called in Marcus, my attorney and trusted friend since college, and told him exactly what I needed done. He listened carefully, eyes narrowing as he took in every detail, then nodded without asking unnecessary questions. We spent hours reviewing the contracts I had carefully drawn up when I quietly bought out the properties that saved my family from financial ruin. For years earlier, when the economy crashed and property values plummeted, I had seen an opportunity most people overlooked. While my family panicked, I stepped in through shell companies and private deals, purchasing the ranch, Brian's office building, and Paige's clinic property before banks or creditors could seize them. I kept their rents low on purpose, knowing it would give them room to recover without realizing where the lifeline came from. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would rebuild and finally see me as something more than the black sheep they'd always labeled me as. But after what happened at that dinner, I saw that no amount of quiet generosity would ever earn their respect. They needed to face reality and understand that the son they belittled was the one who had kept a roof over their heads all these years. So I instructed Marcus to prepare formal rent adjustment notices, bringing their leases up to true market value. We combed through every clause of every agreement to ensure there would be no loopholes, no legal gray areas they could cling to when they inevitably tried to fight back. Marcus, loyal as ever, handled it all with precision and care, though I could see the concern in his eyes as he asked one last time if I was sure. I didn't hesitate when I said yes because I knew deep down it was the only way forward. Within 48 hours, the certified letters went out, each one bearing my signature, each one spelling out the new reality in black and white. The ranch rent would rise from $2,000 to $6,000 per month. Brian's law office lease would jump from $4,500 to $10,000. Paige's clinic, once protected by my kindness, would now cost $7,500 monthly. And with those letters sent, the storm I'd unleashed began to rage full force. The first call came from Brian, his voice filled with outrage and disbelief as he demanded to know if I truly lost my mind. He threw around legal threats, warnings of lawsuits, and accusations that I was tearing the family apart for no reason other than spite. I listened in silence for a few seconds before hanging up without saying a word. Paige's messages came next, filled with panic, her carefully polished confidence cracking as she pleaded with me to reconsider. She told me patience depended on her, that I was ruining lives, that I couldn't possibly be this heartless. And then there were the messages from my parents, the most difficult to read. My father's voice, once so steady and commanding, now trembled with desperation as he begged me to return his calls. He spoke of betrayal, of family duty, of the shame I was bringing on our name. My mother's text came at all hours of the night, filled with heartbreak, telling me I was destroying everything she'd ever hoped to hold together. I read them all, each one cutting deeper than the last, but I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked their numbers one by one until the flood of calls and messages finally stopped. But the silence that followed was louder than any words they could have thrown at me. It echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the line I had drawn and could never erase. News of what happened spread quickly through the family, as I knew it would. Some relatives sent messages of quiet support, saying they understood, that they'd seen the way I had been treated for years and couldn't blame me for finally standing up for myself. Others accused me of cruelty, of abandoning the people who raised me, of caring more about money than blood. I read their words and felt the weight of them, but I didn't let them sway me. I focused on my work, pouring everything I had into expanding Grant Capital developments. I spent long nights in the office, reviewing deals, scouting properties, and growing my team. The success I built came not from revenge, but from the freedom I finally claimed when I stopped living for their approval. Yet no matter how high the numbers climbed or how many projects I completed, there was always a part of me that wished things could have been different. Meanwhile, my family began to feel the consequences. Brian had to scale back his practice, laying off staff and moving into a smaller office space that matched what he could now afford. Paige closed her clinic after failing to secure a new location within her budget, returning to hospital work where she no longer called the shots. My parents sold off what remained of the ranch, moving into a modest apartment in town far from the land they once cherished. Through contacts and quiet conversations, I heard the details of their struggles, but I stayed distant, refusing to be drawn back into the web of guilt and obligation. The path I chose wasn't easy, and it wasn't without regret. But as the months passed, I came to see that peace, real peace, wasn't about winning or proving myself. It was about living on my own terms and refusing to be defined by people who never truly saw me. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. As time moved on, I watched the pieces fall exactly where I knew they would, though I can't say it brought me the satisfaction I once imagined it might. Brian's once bustling firm, the pride of his existence, shrank with each passing month as he fought to keep up with the rent he now owed. I heard through mutual contacts that his high-profile clients had begun to drift elsewhere, unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking ship. His carefully polished image, the one that always gleamed at family gatherings, started to crack in ways he couldn't disguise. The sleek suits grew less tailored, the car parked in his reserved spot changed from a luxury sedan to something far more modest, and behind his forced smiles at public events, people began to notice the strain etched across his face. Paige didn't fare any better, though I suspect she fought twice as hard to hide it. The clinic she'd poured so much into, the one she once boasted about at every family gathering, shuttered its doors within months. She tried to negotiate a deal for another location, but commercial rent in her part of town had skyrocketed, and lenders weren't interested in someone with no property to leverage anymore. She took a job at a local hospital, the very kind of position she used to dismiss as beneath her, and though she still wore that familiar confident mask, the shine was gone from her eyes. My parents, once so proud of the land they considered their legacy, sold off the last of it quietly and without fanfare. The sprawling ranch where we'd lived for decades, the place that held generations of memories, became just another plot marked for development. They moved into a small apartment complex on the edge of the city, a far cry from the home they had once ruled like royalty. Ronald, the man who'd spent his life demanding perfection from everyone around him, now worked part-time at a hardware store just to keep the bills paid. Janet, who used to fill the house with plans for dinner parties and charity events, barely left their tiny unit, weighed down by sickness and silence. Through it all, I kept my distance, choosing not to look back at the wreckage they had brought on themselves. I focused on growing my company, surrounding myself with people who respected me for who I was rather than who they thought I should be. The team at Grant Capital Developments became like family to me, not in name or blood, but in loyalty and shared vision. We worked tirelessly, transforming rundown buildings into thriving centers of commerce, turning overlooked plots of land into spaces where communities could grow. I poured myself into every deal, not for revenge or recognition, but because building something real gave me a sense of purpose nothing else ever had. But even as success followed success, there were nights when I lay awake wondering what it might have felt like if things had gone differently. I wondered what it would have been like to walk into that ranch house and be welcomed without judgment, to sit at that table and hear my father say he was proud, to have Brian and Paige see me as an equal rather than a rival or a failure. Those thoughts haunted me more than any of their insults ever had because I knew that no amount of money or success could buy that kind of acceptance. Then, unexpectedly, about 2 years after that final confrontation, I received a message from Janet that I hadn't anticipated. She asked to meet, not to discuss property or money or the fallout of what had happened, but simply to talk. The message was simple and, for the first time in as long as I could remember, free of guilt or demands. Against my better judgment, I agreed, curiosity and perhaps a lingering sense of duty pushing me to see what she had to say. We met at a small park not far from the apartment where they now lived. Janet looked older, far older than the years that had passed could account for, her face lined with exhaustion and regret. She spoke softly, apologizing for everything, not just for the words spoken at that fateful dinner, but for the years of comparison and dismissal that had led us all to that point. She told me about Ronald's illness, the battle he was quietly losing, and she asked me, no. She begged me to come and see him one last time before it was too late. I sat there, torn between the part of me that wanted to stay cold and distant and the part that still, after everything, longed for some kind of resolution. In the end, I agreed, if only because I knew I would regret it if I didn't. When I stepped into that small apartment a few days later, I barely recognized the man who had once loomed so large in my life. Ronald looked small, frail, a shadow of the forceful figure I'd grown up with. His voice was weak, but his words cut deeper than I expected. He admitted that he had spent his life trying to control everything and everyone because he feared what he couldn't shape in his image. He said he envied my independence, hated that I had found the strength to walk a different path, and in that hatred, he had let his pride destroy the bond we might have had. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, and we didn't pretend that one conversation could heal years of damage. But we spoke honestly, for the first time in my life, and when I left that day, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd finally put down a weight I'd carried since I was a boy. Ronald passed a few months later, quietly, with Janet by his side. I didn't attend the funeral for appearances or to prove anything. I went because it felt right to close that chapter with honesty rather than bitterness. But as it turned out, that wasn't the end of the story. At the wake, Brian approached me with what seemed like an olive branch, a proposal to buy back the ranch land I now owned. He spoke of preserving the family legacy, of honoring Ronald's memory, of starting fresh. Paige stood beside him, nodding in agreement, adding her own appeal for forgiveness and a new beginning. For a fleeting moment, I considered their offer, wondering if perhaps they had finally seen the truth of who I was. But something in their eagerness felt off, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that there was more to the story than they let on. I hired a private investigator to quietly look into their plans, and what he uncovered didn't surprise me, but still stung in a way I hadn't expected. Brian and Paige weren't planning to preserve anything. They were in secret negotiations with a major developer, looking to flip the land for triple what they would have paid me, using Ronald's death and the guise of reconciliation as leverage. The betrayal wasn't shocking, but it was a painful reminder that some people only see value in what they can take. When the truth came out, I didn't react in anger or try to retaliate. Instead, I made a different choice, one that left them speechless and stripped of their schemes. But that's a story for another part of this journey, one that I'll share soon enough. The night I learned about Brian and Paige's plan to sell the ranch for a massive profit, I didn't sleep at all, lying awake in the quiet darkness of my apartment, staring at the ceiling as every possible response played out in my mind. I could have confronted them immediately, called them out in front of what little family we had left, exposed their greed for all to see, but something in me hesitated because I realized I didn't want another explosive scene filled with shouting and accusations that would ultimately change nothing. Instead, I decided to wait for the perfect moment, one where the truth would hit hardest and leave no room for their usual denials or manipulation. Over the next few weeks, I kept my distance, acting as if I hadn't discovered their scheme at all, though it took every ounce of restraint I had not to let the anger spill over during the few polite, forced conversations we shared. They continued to push their proposal, sending emails filled with hollow promises of rebuilding family unity and honoring Ronald's memory, even suggesting we could co-manage the land as equals. But their words felt as empty as their intentions, and I knew better than to fall for it. Behind the scenes, I worked with my legal team to make sure every detail of my plan was airtight, because I wasn't just going to shut down their attempt to profit off our father's death. I was going to make sure they never had the chance to twist our family's history to suit their narrative again. The opportunity came sooner than I expected when the lawyer handling Ronald's estate scheduled a formal reading of his will, inviting every immediate family member to gather at his small office in town. The room was cramped and smelled faintly of old books and stale coffee, and as we sat there waiting for the proceedings to begin, I watched Brian and Paige carefully, noting the way they exchanged glances filled with unspoken confidence, as if they had already decided they'd won. Janet sat beside me, quieter than I'd ever seen her, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if the weight of everything that had happened had finally caught up to her. When the reading began, I listened in silence as the lawyer went through the formalities, outlining modest bequests and final instructions, most of which reflected a life that had long since shifted from prosperity to practicality. There was no grand inheritance, no hidden fortune, nothing that would have changed anyone's circumstances, but Brian and Paige barely reacted because they knew, or rather, they thought they knew, that the ranch was their real prize. They didn't realize that while they plotted in shadows, I had already decided its future, and it wasn't going to include them. When the reading ended and people began to rise from their seats, offering half-hearted condolences and promises to stay in touch, I stood and asked everyone to remain a moment longer because I had something important to share. The room grew still, the tension thick enough to taste, as I pulled a folder from my bag and laid out the documents that would bring the truth to light. I spoke calmly, without anger or accusation, as I detailed what the investigator had uncovered, the backroom meetings, the draft agreements with the developer, the planned sale that would have turned a tidy profit for Brian and Paige while leaving behind nothing of the legacy they claimed to cherish. Brian's face turned pale as the realization hit that their scheme had been exposed so thoroughly, there was no point in denying it, while Paige, ever the performer, tried to feign outrage, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that they only wanted what was best for the family. But the evidence was undeniable, every signature, every email, every meeting documented and verified, and for the first time, their words fell flat because no one in that room could pretend not to see the truth anymore. And then I made my final move, one they never saw coming. I announced that I had already transferred the ranch to a conservation trust, dedicated in Ronald's name, ensuring that the land would never be sold, never developed, and never again used as a pawn in someone's game for wealth or power. The trust's mission would be to protect the land's natural beauty, provide educational programs for local schools, and serve as a lasting tribute not to Ronald's failures as a father, but to the best parts of what our family could have been. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the sound of Brian muttering something under his breath that I didn't bother to catch, while Paige simply stared at me, the mask of control she wore for so long slipping at last. After that, there was nothing left to say, no grand reconciliation, no final apology, no sudden burst of understanding that would tie everything up in a neat bow. People left quietly, some offering me hesitant nods of respect, others too ashamed or angry to meet my eyes. I stayed behind for a while, standing at the window of the lawyer's office, looking out at the town I'd once called home, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't win anything that day, at least not in the way some might see it, but I walked away knowing I had chosen integrity over revenge, purpose over profit, and in doing so, I finally broke the cycle that had haunted me my entire life. In the weeks that followed, word spread about what I'd done, and as expected, reactions were mixed. Some called me noble, others called me heartless, but for once, I didn't care what anyone thought because I knew deep down I had done what needed to be done. I returned to my life in Houston, to my work, my team, and to the quiet satisfaction that comes from standing firm in your convictions, no matter the cost. The ranch remained untouched, a symbol not of what we lost, but of what I chose to protect, and that, more than any fortune or title, became the legacy I was proud to leave behind. I thought that chapter of my life had closed for good, But life has a strange way of reminding you that some stories refuse to end exactly when or how you want them to. I spent the following months fully focused on my work, channeling every bit of my energy into expanding my company's reach, closing deals that mattered, and building something that felt real and lasting. The ranch, now protected and flourishing under the Conservation Trust's care, became a symbol in the community for preservation and purpose, drawing attention and praise that I never sought but quietly appreciated. I stayed far away from family gatherings, distant holidays, and any attempts at forced reconciliation because I had made peace with the path I chose. But then, out of nowhere, I received an email that stopped me cold, not from Brian or Paige, but from Janet, sent late at night as if she hesitated before finally pressing send. The subject line was simple: "Please read this." Inside, the message was brief, almost painfully so, just a few lines where she admitted that everything had fallen apart for Brian and Paige far worse than I might have realized. Their failed schemes had left them burdened with debt, strained relationships, and reputations damaged beyond easy repair. She wrote that Brian's marriage had ended quietly, his wife unwilling to weather the storm he had created. Paige, once admired in her field, had lost nearly every professional ally she'd ever had because no one wanted to be associated with what she'd become. Janet pleaded for me to meet with her one last time, not to ask for money or favors, but because she wanted to explain something she believed I deserved to know. I stared at that message for a long time, torn between deleting it and responding immediately. Against all reason, I chose to meet her, driven by a mixture of curiosity, residual affection, and perhaps some small hope that I could finally close the book on this chapter once and for all. We met at a small, quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one would pay us much attention. Janet looked tired and thinner than I remembered, her eyes heavy with sadness that didn't seem forced or exaggerated. She told me something I never expected to hear, something that shifted my understanding of the years that had passed. Ronald, before he died, had quietly written a letter addressed to me, a letter Janet had kept hidden out of fear that it would only open old wounds. In it, he admitted everything I had always suspected but never thought he'd put into words: that he envied me, that he resented my independence because he lacked the courage to forge his own path when he was my age, and that every harsh word he spoke had come from his own sense of failure, not mine. He wrote that he was proud of what I had built, even if he had never been able to say it to my face, and that his greatest regret was letting pride destroy what little chance we had at understanding one another. I sat there in stunned silence, reading that letter, feeling emotions I couldn't name washing over me all at once. For a long time, I said nothing, just stared down at the words he'd written, trying to process what they meant now that he was gone and the damage had already been done. Janet said she'd wanted to give me the letter at the funeral but lost her nerve, worried that it would only cause more pain. She asked me if I could ever find it in my heart to forgive the past, not for Brian or Paige, not even for Ronald, but for myself, so I could stop carrying a weight that no longer needed to burden me. I left that cafe with the letter folded carefully in my jacket pocket, unsure what I would do next, but knowing that something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't yet explain. Back in Houston, I returned to my life, but with a quieter mind, one that no longer replayed the old insults or sought approval from people who could no longer give it. The work continued, the deals came and went, and I found myself spending more time at the ranch, not to check on it, but to walk its fields in peace, to remind myself that some legacies are worth protecting not because of who built them, but because of what they can become. Then came the final, unexpected turn that no one could have predicted. Months after receiving that letter, I was approached by a nonprofit organization that had heard about the ranch and wanted to partner on a project to create an educational center for underserved youth, teaching them about conservation, agriculture, and the history of the land. It was a chance to turn something born from conflict into a gift that would last far beyond my lifetime. I agreed without hesitation, throwing my full support behind the project, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with proving myself or righting old wrongs. But the real surprise came during the groundbreaking ceremony, when a familiar face appeared in the crowd: Brian, standing quietly at the edge, not trying to speak, not demanding attention, just watching. After the event ended, he approached me, not with arrogance or excuses, but with the humility I never thought I'd see in him. He admitted that he had been wrong, that everything he'd done had come from a place of fear and jealousy, and that he had finally realized none of it mattered in the end. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness. He only wanted to tell me that he saw what I had built and respected it. That moment, more than anything, brought me the closure I didn't know I still needed. We didn't become best friends overnight, and Paige never reached out. But for once, the story ended not in bitterness or betrayal, but in a quiet understanding that we had both grown, even if it took longer than it should have. And as I stood there on that land, watching children run through the fields we had once fought over, I knew that this was the ending I had been searching for all along. A legacy not built on revenge or regret, but on hope for something better.